Hey everybody, thanks for hopping on tonight. We're gonna get started here and yeah, super grateful for everybody being able to come to this forum tonight. So we have a wonderful guest speaker, and Brook Lenker, our executive director here at KTA, is going to introduce him here in a second. My name is Holly, and I am currently serving as the manager of communications and membership. So thank you for being here, and I'm sure Brooke echoes the same welcome. Um, but before I hand it over to Brooke to introduce our guest speaker, I just wanted to let you know a little bit about some other things that are going on with KTA that's coming up if you're interested in joining us for some other things. We have a couple in-person events coming up that are going to be really special and unique here in the spring. If you've never been to one of our hiking weekends, they're a really cool way to meet some other hikers in the area and get to know some people that are like-minded and just enjoy being out on the trails. Brooke's going to be leading a hike at the Scott Farm in Carlisle later in April as well. It's going to be centered around bluebells, and he'll have some cool things to share about the future of KTA in that particular location as well. And then finally, later in June for National Trails Day, we are hosting a really cool trail care event in the Michoud State Forest called Trail Love. And it's going to be this um, kind of blitz of trail care projects around the forest, all happening simultaneously. It's going to be a lot of fun. So that's a cool way. If you've never done trail care before, it's just a one-day event. So you'll get to see some really different types of projects, and there's going to be lots of things for people to do. So if you've never done trail care, no worries. And if you do trail care all the time, there's going to be something for you too. So check that out. And then if you're unfamiliar with these webinars that we've been doing, there's a lot of them that we've done over the past couple of weeks, and they've all been recorded, and they'll be, or they already are rather, up on the website that you can get caught up with different things about old growth forests or hiking the Appalachian Trail in Pennsylvania, wilderness first aid. There's all kinds of stuff. So you can check those out if you're interested. And then lastly, as we're going through tonight, just if you're not talking, please just keep yourself muted, as sometimes background noise can be a little discombobulating for everybody who's trying to listen. If you have questions as Greg is doing his presentations, you can either put them in the chat or you can raise your hand. And he said that he's okay with either of those options. So if you have questions, we're here to talk about it. So feel free to ask those or raise your hand. And yeah, thanks for being awesome. Um, and just quickly, tonight's agenda, you should, I'm assuming since you are here, that you know what we're doing. But we're going to be talking about climate impacts on Pennsylvania's hiking trails, and we'll hear from Greg about that. And then we're going to take a little bit of time just to talk as a group about some ideas uh, of of the things that he discussed, and then how we can incorporate those moving forward. So I'm going to pass this off to Brooke so he can introduce our really amazing special guest.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. And thanks so much for joining us tonight to talk about a really important topic. Um, and you know, I know that we all know that climate change is coming on full force, and we see the impacts every day. Um, I think it's really important as a trail community to come together and talk about this issue, its many facets, and think about how we, as individuals or as organizational leaders, you know, in the various facets of our lives, think about how we can um, help mitigate climate change, how we can help um, address some of the needs for um, adaptation and yeah, and just kind of do our part. I'm sure we all do our part, but maybe there are more things we can do or innovative things we can do. And so I think we'll hopefully have the opportunity to explore some of those ideas a little later. But But yeah, I just want to reinforce how grateful I am for your time tonight. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, who I've known for a number of years, um, and that's Greg Czarnecki. So Greg is the Director of Applied Climate Science for the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. He oversees climate change adaptation for the Commonwealth's 124 state parks, as well as the 2.2 million acres of state forest. He is also the lead author of the department's Climate Action Plan, a co-author of the U.S. Forest Service's Mid-Atlantic Forest Ecosystem Climate Change Assessment and Synthesis. Whew, gee, I love these titles. And he lectures widely on the impacts of and solutions to climate change on natural resources. A few more things about Greg. He also or previously served as the executive director of the Wild Resource Conservation Program. He was a director of the Nature Conservancy's Pennsylvania Science Office, and was an ombudsman for the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. He's a native of Erie, and he holds a Bachelor of Science degree in biology from Gannon University and a Master of Science in Biology from Edinburgh University of Pennsylvania. So I could go on even more and talk about Greg's background, but I guess it's easy to say that Greg has a lot of climate cred, and we're grateful to have you tonight, Greg. So take it away.
Thanks, Brooke. Thanks, everybody, for being here tonight. I share my screen here. Hopefully we are successful. All right, Brooke, can you see the PowerPoint?
We sure can.
Terrific. Thank you. Well, what I'd like to do tonight is talk a little bit about how climate change is impacting Pennsylvania now, what some of the projections are, and then some of the things that we can do about that. And most of the graphs and the information I'm going to share with you tonight come from one of two sources: the 5th National Climate Assessment, which came out about 6 months ago, or Pennsylvania's Climate Impacts Assessment that's actually going to be coming out. The newest version is going to be coming out within the next month or two, so you might get to see a little bit of advanced information here. So we're going to start by looking at the global level, because you kind of have to understand what's happening globally before you can understand what's happening in the U.S. and in Pennsylvania. And as much as I can, I'm going to try to kind of touch on climate impacts on trails, but I'll say right up front, I'm no trail expert. So hopefully most of what I'm going to cover will be relevant, maybe if not to trails, but to somebody who spends time out of doors and is interested in what's happening in the natural world around them. Okay, with that said, as Holly said, if you have a question, if you want to raise your hand, feel free to do that. If there's something you see on the screen that you'd like to have addressed right then and there, it's fine with me. I might not see your hand, so Holly or Brooke, if you do see somebody's hand up, let me know. Okay, so let's start at that kind of global level that we were talking about. And look first at the graphic on the left-hand side. And this is the temperature anomaly from 2023, so last year. And the way you interpret this is areas that are yellow and red are significantly warmer than historic averages. White is at average, and blue is cooler than average. And as you can see, almost all the planet is significantly warmer than average. If you've been paying any attention to the news over the past few weeks, you've heard that we're setting all kinds of records. Actually, the models projected climate, the increases in temperature the past year to be much less than they actually were. So scientists are a little bit stumped why things are happening even faster than they expected. And maybe one of the most troubling things that came out in the news in the past couple of weeks is that the Eastern Atlantic, this area, I've shown my cursor here, near Africa, temperatures there right now are already where they normally are at the peak of hurricane season. So there's a real concern that we're going to see a really bad hurricane season this year because of all the heat that is presenting itself in the ocean there. So if you take a look at this map, you'll see that, particularly if you look at the top of the globe, it's really, really heating quite rapidly. And that has a direct impact on what we're seeing here in Pennsylvania. So take a look at this graphic on the right, and you'll see that this is the sea ice extent from September 19th of last year. So that was the minimum sea ice extent for 2023. And if you take a look, you'll see an orange line. I'm going to kind of trace it with my cursor here. That is where the sea ice extent normally would be. And you can see there's a whole lot of open water where normally there would be ice. In addition to that, the ice that's there is much, much thinner than it normally would be. But this open water is what's really feeding the increase in temperatures in the Arctic. The Arctic is heating far more rapidly than any other part of the planet. And that can be explained by what's called the albedo effect. So if you take a look at this graphic in the middle, at the bottom you see it shows us sunshine, which is the source of all the energy on our planet, hits that ice and snow, and 90% of that energy just reflects back into space. Only 10% is converted to heat. But if you look at the top of this graph, when you see sunshine hits open water, fully 94% of that energy is converted to heat. Only 6% bounces back out into space. So the end result is you have this positive feedback loop. So you get a little bit of open water, the sunlight hits it, warms it real rapidly, melts a bunch of ice, and it just keeps feeding upon itself. And that's why we're seeing these really, really significant temperatures at the northern part of the planet. If you go back 2 summers ago, there were several areas well inside the Arctic Circle in Siberia that exceeded 100 degrees, which is something we didn't think we'd ever see this century. So that's kind of the global perspective. So let's take a look at what's happening here in the US. And so we're going to look at annual temperature and annual precipitation. On the left is annual temperature. Once again, you can see there's a whole lot of red there, especially when you look up in Alaska, especially when you look down in the southwest of the US. And if you look at Pennsylvania, you look at the northwest corner, you look at Erie, and that's really red. And in fact, Erie is the 3rd most rapidly warming city in the United States. So you can see that overall, we've had about a 1.8 degree Fahrenheit increase averaged out across the US. We're also seeing changes in precipitation, and that's because warmer air holds more water vapor. For the most part, the eastern half to almost 2/3 of the US is seeing significantly more rain. In Pennsylvania, it's about 10%. But if you look at the Southwest, you can see that very significant drop in rainfall there. But the real story isn't just the fact that we're getting more precipitation, it's how it's falling. And I'll get to that in a minute here. So if you take a look at those average summer temperatures, what I showed you so far was what we've seen to this point. But the graphic you see at the left comes from a website called 1001 Blistering Future Summers. And you can put in the city or town where you live, and it will show you the average summer temperature today versus the average summer temperature at the end of the century. Now, this is what we call a worst case scenario. This is if we do nothing to get our emissions under control, which is pretty much where we are right now. So I put in Harrisburg, and you can see currently our average summer temperature is just a little bit above 83 degrees. By the end of the century, it'll be above 94 degrees. So we will feel much more like San Antonio, Texas than we do today. And San Antonio, Texas, it's a great place. It's, you've probably been there. You probably like San Antonio, but think about the plants and animals that live there. Think about the kind of crops that they grow there. And you can see that if we were to actually see this occur, it would be catastrophic. So if you take a look at the graphic on the right, this is from our Pennsylvania Climate Impacts Assessment. And what it does is it looks at, just for average temperatures, it looks at what they call a consequence rating for different sectors. And you can see there's human health and environmental justice and several others. And so 0 is there's no consequence. 1 is minor, 2 is major, 3 is severe, and 4 is catastrophic. And if you take a look, there's only one of these sectors that hits that catastrophic category, and that's forests, ecosystems, and wildlife, which is what all of us on this call tonight are interested in. And the projections that we've done using what's called the Climate Change Vulnerability Index, where you assess individual species for their response to climate change. It shows that most of the species that we find in Pennsylvania, plant and animal, would not be able to survive at the end of the century under these kind of temperatures. So
Hey,
let's
hey,
go.
Greg,
Yes.
before you get too far away from that slide,
Yeah.
or actually the slide before,
Okay.
somebody was asking in the chat what information you would have about why Erie is so warm. You mentioned Erie specifically. Is that just the location of it, or things that are going on from people?
I'm trying to recall the exact cause. It's nothing to do with people. It's more related to its place on the Great Lakes, and other factors associated with that. The Great Lakes are being pretty significantly impacted in terms of temperatures, in terms of ice cover, which I'll cover here in a bit. And I honestly don't remember all the details of that. So if that's something that you're interested in, I can certainly kind of dig up that info and share it with folks afterwards.
Cool. And what was the name of the website that you mentioned on the next slide that you could
Yeah,
put
it's right
the
up there. It's called 1001 Blistering Future Summers. The
okay.
easiest way to find it is just Google that,
Okay,
1001 Blistering Future Summers.
cool.
Yep. Okay, so we're going to switch gears from average temperature now to talk about extreme heat, because this should be of interest to everybody because of the human health impacts. So let's start with the top graph here. Once again, these are from the Pennsylvania Climate Impacts Assessment. And it looks at the number of days with temperatures over 90 degrees. And the map on the left shows you the observed number of days. So the historic, and you can see for the most part, other than Philly, we don't have a whole lot of days above 90 degrees in most parts of Pennsylvania. By the end of the century, and once again, this is that worst case scenario, you can see there are parts of the state, including Harrisburg, Hershey, where I'm sitting right now, where we could have 2 to 3 months out of the year where temperatures are above 90 degrees. Similarly, there's a graphic at the bottom that looks at what are known as very hot days, and that varies across the state, how you define that. But once again, we see really, really significant increase. But the real story comes in when you look at the heat index. So these two graphs show you temperature. The heat index is temperature plus humidity. Now, generally speaking, a heat index of 110 or higher is considered not survivable by most forms of wildlife and people as well. And so I have here two extreme heat index readings from Kansas from this past August. You can see one is 134 degrees, the other is 120 degrees. Those were the heat indexes at that time. We didn't think we were going to see anything like this until near the end of the century, and it's already happening. So that is life-threatening temperature. This isn't Saudi Arabia. This is Kansas. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the bottom of the Kansas City, Missouri graphic there, it shows you the air temperature was 95 degrees. You don't have to hit 110 to have a dangerous heat index. You can hit it if the humidity is high enough at 90 degrees plus. So this is a real red flag, particularly for anybody who spends time outdoors, people who live in cities and don't have air conditioning. So it's something to keep an eye on. All right, let's talk about that rainfall again. I said, the real story isn't that we're getting more, it's how it's falling. I think this is something that everybody is recognizing now, that rain is falling in very, very high volumes in short periods of time. And so the map at the left there shows you the percent increase in very heavy rain events, those that normally only occur 1% of the time. And you can see the Northeast US has seen a 60% increase. And if you drill down further, Pennsylvania has seen more than a 70% increase. And it comes in a couple ways. One is like the graphic you see at the lower right. That's from our Loyalsock State Forest, where we had 3 500-year rain events in 3 years. Those are events that normally would only occur once every 500 years. We had 3 of them in 3 years, and they were associated with storms that came up the East Coast, be it a tropical storm or nor'easter. But then you have a situation like you see in the photo above that. This is from 3 summers ago. This is Route 283 between Harrisburg and Lancaster. It was a Friday afternoon. People were going home from work, and a thunderstorm developed, and it dropped almost half a foot of rain in less than an hour. And it literally filled up that roadway. You can see the cars and the tractor trailer that are stranded. That's nowhere near a floodplain or a stream or a culvert. That's simply so much water fell, it couldn't infiltrate the ground rapidly enough, and it literally filled the roadway in the blink of an eye. So we're starting to see things like that. And so why is that happening? We have to go back to the Arctic, because what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. And so take a look at the graphic on the left side, and we're going to look at the jet stream. So the jet stream is that kind of river of air that moves storms and weather systems across North America from west to east. So the normal jet stream is like you see up at top here. It says stable jet stream. It's kind of linear and it moves pretty fast. So it moves these systems pretty quick. That jet stream is driven by the temperature differential between the Arctic and the equator. The bigger the temperature differential, the faster it moves, the more linear it is. But as we've already talked about, the Arctic is getting very, very warm, warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet. So the temperature differential now shrinks. And what happens is the jet stream starts to slow down and it wobbles. It gets wavy like you see here. And so it leads to all kinds of weird things happening. Things like thunderstorms that develop and dump copious amounts of rain and don't move. It leads to pockets of really warm air moving far to the north, while cold air comes far to the south for short periods of time. And that is particularly of interest during the wintertime. So if you turn your attention to the graphic on the right, this is the polar vortex, once again, driven by that temperature differential. Polar vortex is like a wall of air that holds the coldest air in the Arctic. But that wall is breaking down because that temperature differential is shrinking. And so you get the same thing happening in the wintertime. And that's why we get, the media refers to it as the polar vortex. Well, we may get like several days where it's really, really cold and then it warms up. When it gets really, really cold here, it gets really, really warm somewhere else. So it's not unusual for at least a few times out of the year now, a few times out of the winter, that temperatures in many parts of Alaska are warmer than temperatures in Florida. Just some of the weird stuff that's going on because of climate change. So let's talk about a different kind of precipitation now, and that's snow. So I'm sure you probably noticed we're getting a lot less snow than we used to. And that's what the graphic on the left shows you. This is not a projection. This is what's happening now. The orange circles are the areas that are seeing more rain and less snow during the wintertime. The bigger the circle, the bigger the difference. And you can see most of the country is in the same boat as us, seeing less snow, more rain. Now, the graphic on the right is from our climate impacts assessment, and it shows you the average number of days where snowfall could occur. So A on the left here is the historic average, excuse me. And you can see, go to the northern tier of the state, and you can see anywhere from 70 to 90 days out of the year where there's a good chance you're going to see some kind of snow. By the end of the century, under this continuing emissions pathway that we're on, you can see that even the northern tier drops by a half, some places drop by 2/3, less snow than we currently have. That has ecological ramifications, that has groundwater ramifications, and it's something we're already seeing happening. Now, there are exceptions to every rule, and one of them comes from my hometown of Erie, and that's lake effect snow. So a few years ago, Erie got almost 200 inches of snow, which is a lot of snow even for them. And most of it, over 70 inches, fell in just a couple of days, but it was gone within a few days as well. It was a very unusual thing. And that's because if you look at the map at the upper right, that shows you ice cover for that time period. And you can see the Great Lakes were completely open. Now, as little ice as you see in that, this past winter that just ended yesterday, I guess, saw even less ice cover. It was record low ice cover. So when you have an open lake like that, you have the wind blowing across, you get lake effect snow, which is what the graphic at the bottom shows you. Now, generally speaking, you have that moisture picked up from the open water and it's dumped in northwest Pennsylvania. But because the winds are so much stronger, lake effect snow now routinely reaches to Harrisburg. 2 winters ago, we actually had one lake effect event where those lake effect streamers went from Lake Erie all the way to the Chesapeake Bay. With that said, though, if you look at this winter, there was no ice cover, and Erie, I think, has only had 25 inches of snow. So it doesn't always work out this way, but it can. So still sticking with the impacts of climate change, but switching gears a little bit. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with invasive species and pests, and unfortunately, almost all of them do better under a climate change scenario. As climate warms, it benefits almost all these species. And I have 2 examples here. The one on the left is kudzu, which is known as the vine that ate the South. It was imported from Asia as cattle feed back in the 1800s. Cattle don't like it, so they didn't eat it, and it escaped. And it's going rampant throughout the southern United States. It covers buildings, it pulls down trees, grows very rapidly. But we have kudzu in Pennsylvania now, and it seems to be spreading. So these photos are from the city of Lebanon, Pennsylvania, and they show you that kudzu is growing, it's flowering, and it's making seed. Birds like the seeds, and you know what happens then. So we have kudzu as one example of an invasive species. Another more important one is what you see on the right, and that's the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is also a pest from Asia that kills our state tree, the hemlock. And historically, the adelgid was held to the southern parts of the state because it doesn't like really cold winter temperatures. But we don't get those cold winter temperatures anymore. So it's now found across Pennsylvania, and it is killing most of our hemlock trees, which is bad in and of itself. But when you consider the fact that most of our cold water streams in Pennsylvania are cold, in part because they're shaded by hemlock trees, that doesn't bode well for cold water streams and things like brook trout. So we already seeing some declines in brook trout as a result of this. The estimates from the Environmental Protection Agency are that even under a best case scenario for climate change, if we get our emissions under control rapidly, most of the cold water fisheries in Pennsylvania are going to convert to warm water fisheries. What remains, what small amount remains, will be in the Poconos and the Laurel Highlands. All right, let's talk about something that should be of interest to anybody who's into hiking, and that's vector-borne diseases. So I'm just going to touch on a couple here. On the left is a graphic that shows you where you find Lyme disease. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with it. Many of us have had it. Some of us twice. I've had it twice. Because of climate change, ticks in Pennsylvania are active almost year-round. Because of increasing humidity, warmer temperatures, they reproduce faster. And so we get a really significant increase in Lyme disease. This is only one of many tick-borne diseases. Others are increasing as well, but I'm just going to touch on this one. 1 out of every 3 cases of Lyme disease in the US is in Pennsylvania. So we are really ground zero for that. But it's not just ticks as vectors that are a problem, it's also mosquitoes. And that's for 2 reasons. One is that the mosquito season is longer than it used to be because of warmer temperatures. And so there's a website, and you can find it if you just Google disease danger days. It should pop up. And it shows you how many more days per year mosquito season is today versus 1970. And the graph I have here is for Erie. I included Erie because, once again, Erie leads the state in the extension of mosquito season. The mosquito season in Erie is almost a month longer than it was back in 1970. But it's not just that the season is longer, it's also because we have new invasive mosquitoes coming in. And that's what you see at the bottom right there. That's the Asian tiger mosquito, which is found in many parts of Pennsylvania now. They're easy to identify because of the way they look, but also because they're active during the heat of the day. So if you have them, you're going to get bit in the middle of a bright sunny day, unlike most mosquitoes that are active in the evening. They bite really hard and really fast. They're nasty little guys, but they're also the vector for a lot of different diseases, things like Zika virus and chikungunya and dengue fever. Now, we don't have those diseases in Pennsylvania yet, but we have the vector now. So that's kind of the first step. All right, now I'm going to try and touch on a little bit on some impacts that we potentially are going to see on trails. And so the first thing I'll mention are heavy rain events. That's probably the single biggest impact on trail systems. So, when you have parks like here is Swatara Creek Park. This is very close to Hershey Park to kind of orient you. We've been getting a lot of really bad floods here. There are trail systems through a lot of these parks that are suffering as a result of it. The photo at the right is from Caledonia State Park. This was probably 5 or 6 years ago. That's the Appalachian Trail. And in this one spot, it had washed out 3 or 4 times. So you see some of the trail volunteers are taking some measurements. I'm not sure how they resolved this. I was really curious to find out. They were either going to try and armor this section to make it more resilient or relocate this particular part of the trail. So heavy rain events certainly have an impact on trails, both damaging the trails, but also leading to siltation and streams coming from trails that kind of parallel streams. Another potential impact is sea level rise. Now, this is probably not, in the area of trails that you guys work on, but obviously sea level rise refers to the Delaware River. And so this is kind of interesting. Start by looking at the graph at the upper right. And this looks at the consequences of sea level rise today versus mid-century. And so the green is low. So currently it's kind of listed as a low impact. By mid-century, it's a medium impact. And that's because the projection is that by mid-century, we will see a 1.5 foot increase in sea level rise, leading to that increase, in the Delaware River. The really critical point comes at 2 feet. But if you get a storm that comes up the East Coast, that 2 feet is rapidly exceeded. So once you hit that 2 feet, as a combination of a storm event and that sea level rise, you get all kinds of bad consequences. Things like the salt front moves as much as 25 miles up the Delaware River, which is pretty important if you live in Philadelphia. You have salt now intruding on your drinking water supply. Obviously, I'm sure there are some kind of trail systems. I'm thinking like the Heinz National Wildlife Refuge certainly has a trail system that would be underwater because it's right near the airport. And if you hit 2 feet, then the airport runways and hangars at Philadelphia start to go underwater. So that's another potential impact for trails. And then trails are definitely being impacted when you look at Northwest Pennsylvania. So what we're seeing right now are really rapid changes in Lake Erie's lake level. We were 2 or 3 summers ago at the highest level ever recorded. And that's when I took the photos you see on the right. The bottom photo is from Presque Isle State Park, where most of the trail systems were underwater and impassable unless you were wearing hip boots. In addition to that, the photo above is from Erie Bluff State Park. And what happens is when you get those high water levels, you get a whole lot of bluff erosion combined with a lot of runoff coming from the top of the bluff, and it starts cutting back into the bluff face. And there are a number of trails in the Erie Bluffs that run right along that bluff face, and they become undercut. So you can be walking on a trail, not realizing that it's all hollowed out underneath you. So those variations in lake levels in Lake Erie can also have an impact on trails. Let me quickly now just talk a little bit about how species are going to respond to climate change. And there's really three responses you're going to see. One is that they're going to adapt. Some species are just generalists and they can kind of get used to pretty much anything. White-tailed deer is a great example. Some species may do better under a climate change scenario. So I have a picture of a timber rattlesnake there. Some of our analysis shows that they actually may do better under this climate change scenario, which is great because it's a very cool, very beneficial animal. If you can't adapt, then you're going to want to either move to the north or to higher elevation. So you have to be mobile. So certainly birds are mobile, but the question becomes, do they have a place to go? And is the timing right? When they begin to make this shift, are they going to be arriving at the same time that insects are available to feed their young? The Audubon Society has done an analysis and shows that really many of the bird species in North America are at risk because of not having the sufficient habitat to move to, or the phenology, the timing natural events. And this is something that occurred to me today, a couple of days ago. I was working in my yard, and our tree swallows are back. And there really aren't any insects out yet. So hopefully those guys are going to be okay. But timing of a lot of things is thrown off so far this year. All right, and then if you can't adapt and you can't move, then you're just going to disappear. You're going to die out. And so kind of the characteristics for species that are most at risk are that they have a very limited ability to move, or they have very specific habitat requirements. And so two examples you see at the bottom there. On the left is the hellbender, our state amphibian, obviously confined to those waterways. They like cold water. On the right is the spadefoot toad, which is a little guy about the size of your thumbnail that has very specific habitat requirements. And as you can imagine, it's not very easy for that little thing to get up and move a long distance to better conditions. So the question is this happening yet? And in fact, yes, it is. So the Audubon Society has done an analysis of North American birds to see if their winter ranges have shifted farther to the north. And in fact, almost all birds in North America have, and some of them have shifted pretty far. The turkey is found 400 miles farther to the north during the winter now, and the robin has shifted 200 miles farther to the north. And then you have a situation like the red-tailed hawk, which you see there, our most common raptor. Red-tailed hawks, many of them used to migrate out of Pennsylvania during the wintertime, move south. For the most part, they don't anymore. Most red-tailed hawks are year-round residents because of reduced snow cover, warmer temperatures. They have access to food year-round. And then you have kind of a really cool example here of one species beginning to move out of Pennsylvania and another species beginning to move in and replace it. And this is the black-capped chickadee and the Carolina chickadee. And they look pretty much alike. They hybridize. They fill the same ecological niche. And if you take a look at the map on the right, there's a yellow line here. That's the zone of hybridization. And that is moving 1 kilometer to the north every year. So it's an example of one species making its way out, another moving in behind it. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? It's maybe neither, but it's certainly an indication of things are beginning to change. All right, it's not just not just animals that move. Plants can move too. Now, obviously, they don't walk, but what happens is their seeds, as they begin to be spread farther to the north, will germinate farther to the north. And so here's one example. This is Virginia pine. So on the left is the current distribution of Virginia pine, and you can see that it's found in a few places of Pennsylvania, but it's not very common at all. To the right are two maps. The low emissions scenario at the top is that best case scenario. The lower one, the high emissions scenario, is the worst case scenario. And you can see even under the best case scenario, Virginia pine becomes a significant part of Pennsylvania's forest community. We're already seeing other species common in Pennsylvania beginning to decline. Black cherry is declining, as sugar maple is as well. So we're beginning to see these changes occur already. And so I'm just going to wrap up quickly here because I think I might be running over. Brooke, I apologize. What can we do about this? And there's really two strategies. One is adaptation. It's coping with the changes that are going to happen no matter what we do with emissions. You're just going to have to find ways to build resilience. The other is mitigation, which is reducing greenhouse gases. You do that in two ways. One is you stop adding them to the atmosphere. The other is you begin removing them from the atmosphere. I'm not going to really get into those tonight, but all those strategies have to be used at the same time. So about 6 years ago, we developed our first climate change adaptation and mitigation plan. It's available on our website if you're interested in looking at it. We're in the process of revising this right now. It's going to be much broader, include a lot more things. Hopefully that will be done by the end of the year. But just let me give you a couple of examples of some of the things that we're doing to adapt to climate change. And so the way we approach bridges and culverts, which are certainly relevant to trails, is changing. So on the left, this is from Forbes State Forest. That's a traditional culvert. It was a pipe. And you can see that, it's not terribly large. And, think back to that picture that I showed you earlier from Loyalsock State Forest with that washed out culvert. These don't do well under these real high stream flows. And oftentimes, over time, those pipes, because of erosion downstream, kind of perch above the stream. What we're doing now is what you see on the right. This is a much more resilient kind of structure. Typically, most of our culverts were sized for 25-year storm events. Now, most of them we're sizing for 100-year storm events. So you can see it's larger, it's kind of armored, so it's going to be able to withstand that heavier stream flow. And just as importantly, there's no pipe. It's bottomless, which means that you're not going to have that erosion, that perched pipe that prevents connectivity in a stream. So if you have hellbenders in this stream, or you have brook trout, as the water warms, they can now move upstream. There's connectivity to that habitat, and they can reach colder water. From a conservation standpoint, if you look at historically, climate has changed since the planet began. The glaciers have ebbed and flowed across the landscape, and plants and animals got to move with them. But that's a lot harder today because we're here. So, we put in things like cities and towns and energy infrastructure. We've fragmented the habitat. And so it's more difficult for things to move. So what we've done is we've developed the map you see at the top here with the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy that identifies areas that are critical to maintain or restore habitat connectivity. So this is public lands, obviously, but a lot of it's private lands as well. And we give out a lot of grants for land acquisition and easements every year. And so we're taking that into account to try and put our money towards projects that will lead to greater habitat connectivity. Finally, natural climate solutions is a big push for us. And there's a few examples here. On the left, that's a stream channel. That's a riparian corridor, and you can see lots of trees. So forested riparian buffers is a natural climate solution. Those trees are sequestering carbon. They're cooling the stream. They're taking up sediments and preventing that from reaching the stream. And it's very easy to see why this would be a really important piece of habitat connectivity for species on the move. When you look at those places in Pennsylvania that are most important for that, it is ridgetops and it is riparian corridors. The photo at the top right here is from Kings Gap State Park. This is a stream channel that was naturalized by Trout Unlimited. They put meanders in the stream, they put baffles in the stream. So as storm events occurred, the water ran down the mountainside. It now spills over into the adjacent floodplain and infiltrates there instead of all rushing down the mountainside. And since they did this, brook trout have returned to the stream. And finally, at the bottom, planting trees anywhere is good for climate change for all the reasons I just mentioned, but it's especially important in urban areas, city centers, because of all the benefits to mental health, to cooling, It provides habitat. And so that's another big push for us for natural climate solutions. So with that, I will be happy to take questions, and I will stop sharing my screen. Here we go. Okay, can I answer any questions?
Sandy had a comment in the chat that says, just a comment or topic of discussion. Another issue we've experienced in hiking recently is wildfires, increased fire risk in forests, and the smoke from fires, either from near or far. We've had to cancel guided hikes due to poor air quality. Just a comment. I don't know if you have any thoughts or insights to share about that.
Yeah, I definitely have some thoughts and comments. Yeah, last year was an eye opener when that smoke came down from those Canadian wildfires, to the point where I mentioned that we're revising our climate plan for DCNR. We are going to have a whole section in there on the health impacts on our staff from extreme heat and from poor air quality, specifically wildfires, developing a protocol whereby if air quality gets too bad, we might have to pull people in from the field for the same reason you had to cancel hikes. So we're definitely going to be looking at that. Once again, that's not something we anticipated. I mean, to see it to that extent. Wildfires in Pennsylvania itself are on the increase. The projection is maybe as much as a 60% increase as time goes forward. Last year, we had twice as many fires burning 3 times as much acreage as we normally do. In our fire season now, we still have a fire season, but fires are occurring almost any time of the year, whereas that was not the case before. So that's definitely a very big issue in terms of human health. Taking that whole smoke and extreme heat issue a step farther, we're also beginning to think about what about the people that come to our state parks? So we get over 43 million people a year coming to our state parks. What do you do when you have one of these extreme heat events, or you have, one of these air quality events? So we're thinking about that as well.
Thanks for sharing that. Brendan has a lovely comment. He says, do you have any stories about wins or improvements we've seen battling against climate change? I'm looking for something hopeful.
Well, and I should have started with this. I've been giving these presentations for a number of years, and I quickly realized that I was really bumming people out. And especially when I talk to younger audiences, I actually had a student, a high school student, come up to me after one of my presentations, and he was dead serious. And he says, "Is it time to go to Mars?" He says, "Are we lost?" And I felt really awful when he asked me that question. And I said, "No." And I should have started with this. This is absolutely solvable. It's just a matter of having the political will to do it. Although I think we're really beginning, to turn the ship. Are we turning it fast enough? But certainly there are wins. I mean, just looking at the issue of those culverts that I was showing you, the fact that we're taking climate change into account with all of our infrastructure. We've significantly at DCR reduced our emissions. We have a lot of solar facilities now. We have, many of our buildings are green buildings. We're actually right now working with Penn State to do an analysis of our carbon footprint, with the goal that we want to become carbon neutral. And that certainly is doable. So yeah, it's solvable. There are things that are happening that are useful and that are helpful. Hopefully that helps a little bit.
Well, thank you, Greg. It was a very informative presentation. Sobering, but informative. And I appreciated some of those examples you wove in about some trails in Pennsylvania. I have a friend who lives in California in the Bay Area, and he regularly sends me photos of a bike trail that he uses in Marin County that is constantly flooded now by king tide when king tides occur, and because of obviously rising sea levels. So yeah, I mean, these things are happening. Um, I'm I'm anxious to get into some of the positive things that we can do as a trail community, but I do want to learn more about um, some of the impacts that we're seeing, some specific cases, and I do wonder as we go into that question, Greg, as folks that are on this webinar tonight, maybe have stories to share. They may have photos to share too, and whether they have them now or maybe going forward, is that something that would be helpful to feed to you if we have examples of things that are indicative of, say, um, impacts on trails that are related to these extreme weather events or whatever. Um, if I mean, I know you don't want to be inundated, but if somebody had something, would that be helpful for you to have for
Well,
your presentations?
well, for sure, if those impacts are on a state park or in a state forest, yeah, definitely. Um, but even beyond that, if you have photos of particularly interesting impacts on trails, or better yet, if you've found ways to make trails more resilient to climate change, I would love to have photos of something like that, and not just for my presentation, but to share with some of our staff.
Yeah. Okay. Well, excellent. Well, we can think about that. So our first question for all of you tonight is, um, how how have you seen climate change related impacts affect trails that you maintain or hike? Um, and if anybody has some stories to share, we can call on you and let you do that.
I'm going to read Jen's comment if she has anything else that she'd like to piggyback off of it, but it is, I think, an important point. She said an increasing impact to trails along with the extreme rain events is high winds, saturated soils, and dead ash trees leads to many, many, many more trees down on the trails. So that is a direct impact.
Yeah.
That's certainly something we're seeing in our state parks, particularly in places like Presque Isle, where the trees are already kind of shallowly rooted in sand. When we get these big storms, you get a lot of trees coming down. It's particularly concerned around campgrounds and things like that. And so the ash trees, for sure, you got to get rid of those. But more and more, I mean, even if you watch the news, we have these big wind events. You hear stories about people that are killed by trees crashing into their house, um, never realizing that those trees were hollow inside. And I think it's just a function of, could be pests, along with the fact that trees are kind of aging out in some of the residential areas. And there is definitely an increase in wind events as a result of climate change.
Interesting. We have some other comments?
Rich just shared that he was hiking the AT around Bethel, Pennsylvania a few years ago, 2018. The AT was just a flowing stream of water. So, yeah, seeing those increased rainfalls and rising waters.
Yeah, I just want to comment on Jen's comment about high winds and trees down. I mean, we're seeing a lot of that. And I think in some cases, it is a combination of high wind events, the heavy rain events, the erosion that may have undermined roots in some cases, the invasive species that are killing the trees in some cases, which are also obviously, as you pointed out, Greg, exacerbated by climate change. Um, so it is sort of a perfect storm. And from a standpoint that of KTA that does a lot of, and Jen is our manager of trail maintenance. We see the person power it takes to clear these trails of all the down trees. It really affects the ability of hikers to enjoy and explore these trails. So I see Brandon said, I see a lot of water-related issues from heavy rains, which make public trails less accessible. Absolutely. Well, if we don't, any other comments or stories that folks would like to share about sort of the impacts that they've witnessed? Yes, Sandy says it's important to remind public about the increasing risks in our forests, you know, from things like falling trees and so, yeah, yeah. She says that especially folks who aren't as experienced in the outdoors may not realize some of these risks and how high winds or fire risk can, you know, affect them. Thank you. Thanks, Sandy. All right. Well, how about we move to another question? We can always come back if anybody has any further stories or comments on that. We can circle back. But I'd like to, yeah, let's kind of pivot to things that we can do or ideas we may have um, that can address climate change and climate change impacts. Anybody have any good ideas they'd like to share? And these could be, I mean, and right now, I guess I'm thinking about, you know, big ideas, but nobody's measuring. So um, anything that comes to mind, it could is fair game. And if it's helpful, I'll not that I want to or mean to monopolize our conversation, but sometimes just to kind of plant the seed of thought. You know, I was wondering, and I know there are examples, this isn't an original idea. I know that there are examples of this out there, but I think about, so this would be more in the solutions or mitigation category, perhaps. But I think about how there are so many trailheads um, across the state, and yeah, could at least in some cases where there's some, you know, connectivity to electricity, could there be more charging stations at trailheads that would incentivize, you know, as a electric car owner, one of the fears, of course, is, you know, is range anxiety. And sometimes going to a trail means you have to drive, you know, back some roads where you don't want to be low on electricity. So having more charging options is a good way, I think, to break down some of the barriers to electrifying transportation. So that's my thought. I'm seeing some comments
Yeah.
in the chat. Oh, do you want to go ahead, Holly?
Oh no, I was just gonna read out some of these. A few people mentioned organizing tree planting events. Somebody else also mentioned electric and hybrid, regular trail maintenance and volunteer opportunities to keep trails safe, interfacing with other user groups such as birders, bikers, rock climbers, etc., to combine efforts on some of these challenges.
Yeah, that's great.
I think just having like the data available is interesting. If there be like a method to track stuff, like if trails are having to be rerouted due to some kind of like climate related conundrum, if that's somehow reportable, it would be interesting, like over the next 10, 20 years, like how often are trails being severely impacted by these things or yeah, just I mean even Jen's comment about like down trees, I have no idea like how you'd track how many trees um or if there's any kind of way to get a handle on, you know, the amount of chainsaw volunteers needed, like increase in training more chainsaw volunteers or something to help with that effort.
One thing I meant to mention earlier, kind of related to that, I'd asked some of our folks, is there any specific examples of stuff we're doing with trails? And one piece of information I got, and somebody on here might already be familiar with this, is that the Center for Land Use and Sustainability at Shippensburg recently completed a trail suitability analysis for the Mountain Creek watershed in the Show State Forest. And that trails being impacted by repeated flooding are going to be considered for relocation or bridges, boardwalks, and hardening techniques. I think more of our state forests are beginning to look at that. So that might be another way potentially for folks with this organization to get involved or think about, identifying those areas that are really at risk and then finding ways to address that.
Yeah. Thanks, Greg. Yeah, actually, I know that Jen and I both participated actually in that in that Mountain Creek exercise, and it was really interesting. And the fact that they had the forest district had mapped sensitive areas and wet areas already, helped us identify potential reroutes, or in some cases closures too. But yeah, it was a really interesting exercise.
Jen and Ryan also both sort of had similar feedback. Jen was saying moving forward, just being more intentional with sustainable trail building methods, which divert water better downhill instead of down the trail. And Ryan had a similar comment of adjusting trail systems to be more sustainable, such as get them away from the steep slopes or bluffs, like in some of Greg's photos, and redesign them so that erosion is less likely.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I saw your comment, Ryan, about Rothrock, and I think you're correct. I think they were looking at sustainable trail design. Yeah, do we have any other thoughts about kind of any big ideas or projects that, it's interesting, the comments about tree planting. I've often thought, I realize that in some cases, or perhaps in many cases, our trails go through forested environments. In some cases, they're already on state forest land, but certainly there are opportunities to, how extensive, I don't know, but certainly there are opportunities to do more reforestation or afforestation maybe along some of our trails. So would be interesting to see if more folks in the trail community would be interested in partaking in tree planting projects on specific trails. Again, I don't know how extensive those opportunities are, but I think that would be interesting. And there's certainly, and Greg, I'm sure you could, you're familiar with some of these initiatives being, involved with DCNR, that there are some various initiatives to get trees out to interested parties to plant, even individuals. There's a lot of trees being peddled these days, and so there's materials there that we could take advantage of, and maybe, even KTA could help facilitate some of that. So that's something we could look into if there's interest.
Now, the big push for us now is that there's a lot of money available from the federal government for tree planting, but it's in environmental justice areas primarily. So I believe that we are in a process now of getting $10 million for tree planting in environmental justice areas. That's in Pennsylvania. Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and I think Allentown also got $1 million each for this kind of thing. I'm not sure if there's an intersection here, where there are city trail systems, perhaps, where you could get involved in tree planting. I suspect most of the trails you focus on are like more, in state forests or state parks. Does your group engage with trail groups within, urban areas and cities?
Yeah, I would say our organization is is probably weighted towards more natural surface trails that tend to be in more rural and or forested areas or public lands. But there certainly are members and even some clubs that are part of our regular membership that may have those opportunities and are located in more developed areas. So,
I
well,
was gonna,
okay.
were you gonna transition? I had one thing I was gonna bring up. It's Ryan Such. Hey, Greg.
How you
Nice
doing,
to see
Ryan?
you. All right. I was gonna try to maybe tee up Greg a bit about the tree planting question in that like I was thinking of some like hemlock groves where we've seen a lot of hemlock loss on state forest land, and like that's kind of why people went there. And so if you are going to replant in places like that, you need to replant kind of the right thing given a climate change scenario. And I know that you're well versed in like that type of like assisted migration planning, or like what should be planted if you are going to go into an area that's been impacted. So I thought maybe you could speak about that a bit.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I mentioned our climate plan that we developed 6 years ago. And in there, we had worked with U.S. Forest Service and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science to identify trees that would do better under future climate scenario. And it was broken down by physiographic region. Um, that was 6 years ago, and the science has changed a whole lot. So the Bureau of Forestry right now is working with the Forest Service again to identify trees that will do better under future climate scenarios. That process is ongoing, and hemlocks are certainly a part of that. DCR has a hemlock, I think it's called a management plan, where they do make recommendations for things to plant depending upon where you are. But they're actually researching also resistant hemlocks, because there are places where the hemlock is surviving the adelgid. And so they're studying the genetics to see how can we take those hemlocks and propagate them. So that's certainly looking at those species that are going to do better under those future scenarios as potential hemlock replacements is something our Bureau of Forestry is working on. So if you do get to a point where you want to do some tree planting, we certainly can interface there and make recommendations for what might be the best thing to plant.
Great. Well, thank you. Yeah, the last question we had this evening was sort of just a variation on the second question, but maybe instead of really big ideas, we were wondering if there are small things that you might be interested in doing or could identify that has a climate change mitigation or adaptation angle. And it might be just something small. Maybe it's something, if you're involved in a trail club, it's something your club could try. It could be tried at one place, maybe. Um, and it doesn't have to be a thing. It could be something, maybe it is along the lines of communication. But whatever it is, one of the things we wanted to bring up tonight is that Keystone Trails Association does have a very small grants program. Usually they're typically at $500. I know it's not a lot of money, but if somebody wanted to pilot something in a particular place or or try something within their organization, that potentially could be a source of funds. But whether or not it requires specific, dedicated funding, I'd be curious to know if any of you have any just kind of light bulbs have gone off that you'd like to share. And I know we hit you kind of cold with that question. So
I think something for me, I know Greg, like you mentioned the younger generation, like teenagers and stuff. I hear that a lot of the younger generation just seems like extra sensitive to this topic. And for me, like I know this is happening, like I know that things are different and um but I do think that it's important for people to gently spend time out in nature to realize that nature is very resilient and very strong, and it is doing its best to survive as it has over the millennia that it's been around. So if there's for like catering events or hikes or educational opportunities towards younger folks to get them out in a gentle manner of like, hey, let's like go out and just watch nature and see that it's beautiful and see that it's thriving in its own way. And just as a way to kind of to Brennan's question of, what are the good things, like taking them out and being like, hey, let's name 20 good things that we see in the woods right now, and kind of reestablishing that harmony that we have with nature, and we're all part of it, and like easing the fear, but also empowering them to like still be able to take change. But I think there's just like a um how can we support one another rather than like getting each other like super riled up about stuff. I'm not sure if that like is making sense what I'm trying to say, but um yeah.
Yeah. No, Holly, I think that's interesting. And um I'd like to come back to that, but somebody just said it's Jen said more emphasis on carpooling for our group hikes and trail work events. I think that's a great point. There's so many opportunities to kind of put conservation first, even though sometimes it's not as expedient um, or isn't even because of just past practice isn't necessarily the first thing that comes to mind. It's great. It's important to provide example. I love that. Um, looks like and Sandy said we've offered transportation to some hikes, outdoor opportunities. Um, it's also helpful from the accessibility standpoint too. And Brendan said awareness leads to interest, which leads to action. I agree.
Ollie, kind of following up with something you just said, and combining it with the tree planting idea. Perhaps, $500 could go towards a project where you identify an area where you want to plant some trees, but you have, students or, a group of young people do the work. And there's a website called iTree or iTree Design, where you can actually go in and you can geographically locate an area and hypothetically plant however many trees you want of whatever species you want, and it will graph out and show you over the next 25 years how much carbon they'll sequester, how much storm water they will take up, how much sedimentation they'll take up or prevent from entering the stream, and pollutants they'll remove from the air. That might be a cool activity where the kids go out, plant a tree, and you can show them this is what's going to happen next 25 years. That this is something you did that's going to, fight climate change.
That's cool. I'm reading Ryan's comment. He said is important any physical thing we would do, like reroute a trail or plant some trees. It is really important that we try to make more people care and also give people hope that we can solve these problems. Oh, and then,
Yeah, Ryan, that is the tool I was talking about. Thanks for posting that.
itreetools.org. Very cool. I was Holly, I know you'll appreciate this. I was just over the weekend, confess my neighbors were away, and I've been eyeballing these big white pines that really sprung up over the last few years. And I thought, I haven't climbed a tree for a long time. So I don't know if any of my other neighbors saw me, but I climbed this white pine and sat in it for a few minutes. And I realized, wow, what a great joy tree climbing is. But the, sitting there, and it was windy too I think it was Sunday. And yeah, I mean, to really kind of get in the rhythm of the tree and to think about what all the services it was giving back to me and, to our surroundings I mean, I know it's obvious, but sometimes you have to pause to remember all that. And it was a real joy. So my point is go out and climb a tree and contemplate how that tree helps us, you know, mitigate climate change.
I had a very similar experience last weekend when it was really sunny. I took a walk around my friend's neighborhood, and I was like walking on the sidewalk, and I was like, you know what? I took my shoes and my socks off and I walked in my bare feet in people's yards, like along the sidewalk, and it just felt so good to have like my feet in the grass, and it felt, yeah, like similarly, it was just like it feels good just to be connected like straight on the earth. Um, Something related to tree planting. If your trail club is a nonprofit, there are organizations out there that you can ask for, like they'll send you a kit with different plants to make a pollinator garden, and they'll send them to you for free, and it's super cool. So just like a bunch of different plants that you can plant for purely for the sake of giving insects and butterflies and stuff a place to go and have fun. Um, so I think that's really cool.
It's a great one. Yeah, and I think it's exciting too to see, speaking of hope, I find some hope in the interest in natural landscaping. It has some different names but it does seem to be on a upward trajectory. Um, and that's encouraging because, not only obviously does it build resiliency for nature and provide food for critters and stuff, but I think the an interesting side angle on that is that turf grass, of course, not only is it a monoculture, but all the inputs that it requires sort of perpetuate climate change because it's all based on fossil fuels, and there's a lot of pollution produced in producing those fertilizers and chemicals. And so it's a small thing, but it can be huge. I mean, if it really catches on, when you look at how much, and taking care of turf grass requires things. So the more we can mitigate or minimize turf grass and build natural landscapes, rebuild, you're rebuilding nature essentially. So that's a cool thing. And I would imagine that there are places that, some of the trail and hiking organizations could undertake projects like that too. Well, is everybody like um do we have any more comments coming in? Um, Earthing. That's what he said. You were earthing, Holly.
Yeah, earth all the time. It's great.
You're, um,
I
I love
always
it.
touch the trees when I walk and stuff.
Very cool. Well, I know it's getting late, and I appreciate everybody's attention tonight and um all the interest. And Greg, I appreciate your time and all the interesting things you shared. Um, I hope you have some good ideas and that you can attempt in the future, and just, if nothing else, just continue to speak truth to power and help illuminate these issues for other people, and help however you can. I think, well, I appreciate your interest in these KTA webinars too. So I know we'll have some other great ones coming up, and we have some exciting in-person trainings. So yeah, I appreciate your involvement in the organization. So at this point, Holly, I'll let you take us home if you have any final thoughts to share.
Yeah, just wanted to remind everybody that this was recorded. So if you have colleagues or friends or something later that you think would benefit from it in some way, you'll get an email within the next day or two with a link to the recording. And then I'm going to follow up with Greg if there's any links that he um, would like to share that were either out of his presentation or just other things that he might think that people might find valuable. And then I'll also link in the email too to the information about KTA's grant program. So if you are a club or know a club that might again benefit, please pass the word along. Yeah, just echoing the gratitude for showing up on a Wednesday evening to spend some time with us and talk about these important issues. Um, so yes, again, Greg, thank you so much. This was super, super delightful,
You're
and
welcome.
your knowledge and everything has been wonderful to share with the group. So, yeah, thank you everybody so much. I hope everybody has a wonderful evening.
Yeah. Good night, everyone.
Good
All
night.
right.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.